locals wonder why a full month hasn't yielded more answers.
It doesn't seem too hard in a college town. You know, there's Wi-Fi everywhere. You can track phones so easily. Uh, my phone connects to everything I walk by.
Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Maddie Mogan, and Kaylee Gonsalves were stabbed to death sometime during the morning of November 13th. Moscow police officials tell News Nation they will provide a new update on the investigation on Monday. One former FBI special agent believes the suspect is someone familiar with the property.
One former special agent believes that the perpetrator is familiar with the property. And doesn't that also mean familiar with the suspects, right? Now, I think one aspect that has been lost during the past 4 weeks, really lost in this whole month, is you really need to start with the most obvious details in a crime like this. You need to define it. You need to define what you're talking about. Are we talking about a serial killer? Do you guys think that that is the case? Are we dealing with a serial killer? Are we dealing with a mass murderer? And that's asked in the poll. So make sure you vote if you haven't already. What do you think is the type of crime that we're talking about here? Do you think it is a spree killer? What would you define this particular crime as? What would you say? So let's have a look at what you have said so far in the poll. So let's bring it up here. So 41%, quite surprising, 41% say rampage killer. 10% say serial killer. I would have expected that number to be a lot higher based on what I've read. 22% say mass murderer and 28% say spree killer. We've got 87 votes so far. Keep them coming in. Let's see how that changes as we go through this. But what do you think the experts have been saying? What do you think some of the experts have been saying about serial killer, mass murderer? The word incel has come up as well. I've actually written a book about that, right? By the way, for those who don't know me, I'm a true crime author. Let's see if I can find the book that I wrote about incels. It's one of these. I've often referred to this book here, Murder Most Foul. It's also relevant to this case in the fact that it is really gratuitous. Let's just see if we can find the book I wrote about incels. It's actually, the title is Incel. Where is it? There it is, right? Incel, cause and effect, very poorly reviewed. And then it dealt with Elliot Rodger, also Nicholas Cruz. And then there's also this one, Slaughter, also one of the most poorly reviewed books that I've written, but I feel these are two of probably the best books that I have written. Very hard to write, very difficult to plow through, but nevertheless quite important. If you guys are interested in the research that went into that, check it out. You can check it out at this link. Just a quick greeting to you guys. The Humble Grower, good to see you. Terry Dean, good to see you as well. Paula Buck, Mel Stiller. Crime Geek says Rampage. So we're going to test that and assess that right now. Okay, so let's get started. Let's bring it up like that. Okay. So have you guys heard this before? Have you heard these words before?
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David. When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
Were you guys able to hear that? When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony. Now, we are comparing that, an off note, to misdiagnosing, misdefining this particular crime. So if you think that you are looking for a serial killer, are you then looking for an incel type individual? Or are you looking for someone familiar with the students or not, right? If you calling it a mass murderer, like the mass shooters that you see, what are you actually talking about there? And so if you can't define the crime accurately, then you're going to not be able to profile your killer properly. Does that make sense? So it's all about the diagnosis right in the beginning. And I've got to acknowledge it is quite a difficult diagnosis, because one of the problems is you're not absolutely certain who the original victim is, who the primary victim is. Is it all four? Is it Ethan? Is it Xana? Is it Kaylee? Or is it Maddie? And if you don't know the answer to that, that can kind of get you already in terms of the wrong note scenario, destroying the whole symphony, right? Okay, so how do we get to the right note? Well, we look at what some of the experts have been saying. We look at, again, at other types of crimes and criminals, and we try and fine tune it to what makes the most sense, right? So let's do that. In true crime, especially in the phase we are in now, in this case, where we are searching for a perpetrator and faced with the basic question, is he a stranger or was he familiar to the crime scene and the victims? We need to be clear on an even more basic question. What sort of crime are we dealing with here? So when we ask the question, is the person we're looking for a stranger? Was he a complete stranger, or was he familiar to the crime scene and the victims? If he was familiar, how familiar? Was he very close? Was he somewhat close? What are we talking about here? So in order to address and answer that question, we need to ask another question, which is, what sort of crime are we actually dealing with here? Can we define it? Well, can we define it? Wolfie says, my real answer is revenge spree. Okay. So if you take that question, is he a stranger or was he familiar? And then you look at the type of crime that you're talking about, a kind of a rampage crime, a kind of someone who seemed to be extremely emotional, possibly angry, possibly humiliated, possibly both. Is that someone who's a stranger? And the answer is it could be. It could be someone who's humiliated by society, who's humiliated by his university experience. But is that more likely than a more personal attack, right? It's more personal and it's more emotional and it's more targeted. And so that is the issue where there's some uncertainty a month later. And how do we sort of get some certainty in terms of that issue? Lisa Stokes says familiar and fairly close and emasculated. Okay. Crime Geek says familiar. Leah says I chose mass murderer. So Leah, do you think with mass murderers there is a close personal connection to the victims? So if you take Adam Lanza, well, there was to one of his victims, his mother, but then not to any of the others. Lanny says he was a random killer and he was after killing Kaylee. Isn't that a bit of a contradiction to say that? Random and targeted? Maybe it's not. Maybe it was someone who came across Kaylee that night and then felt insulted in some way that night. But does that make sense? Maybe if he was under the influence of something, so I suppose it's possible. Is it likely? Okay. Anthea says he's been there, but as an acquaintance. Okay. So let's look at what some of the experts have been saying. So what sort of crime are we dealing with here? Can we define it? Well, while analyzing this case, I've seen my own community make suggestions. I've seen in chat it coming up over and over again. Aren't we dealing with a serial killer? I've seen that come up over and over again. And sometimes people say this with quite a lot of certainty, and you think, where's this coming from? Like, where's this idea coming from? And you start to wonder where it's coming from. Now, my own personal opinion is based on my gut feel, based on intuition, based on the facts that we know, based on a certain amount of expertise in this area. As I say, I've written at least 2 books on people who commit multiple murders in a very short period. In terms of the books that I've written and what I know about it, I would say this is not a serial killer, right? So that's kind of my assessment, is that it just doesn't look or feel like a serial killer. You might say, how can you say that? I'm going to explain that in a moment. Roseanne, thanks very much for that. Thanks a lot. Okay. So who is it that thinks it is? Who thinks that it is a serial killer? And could it be? And if it's not, why not? So is there anyone in chat right now that thinks that this could be a serial killer? So let's go back to the poll. The poll is fluctuating. Rampage killers 45%, serial killer 11%. So right now, serial killers got the least amount of votes. But is there anyone here that thinks it could be a serial killer? Lisa says the killings were personal. Jamie says, I don't know the true definition of each. That's a great point. And so we're going to do that. We're going to define each one right now. Okay, so let's do that. So as early as November 19th, less than a week after the crime, like 6 days after the crime, basically a quarter of the way into the month-long timeline, the 4-week timeline, in other words, where we are now in terms of the timeline, right? 4 weeks later, 1 month later, just 6 days later, the Sun cited a so-called crime expert pontificating on how similar this case is, the Idaho student murders, to the Gainesville Ripper in Florida. And the very next day, another publication basically repeated the same expert's assessment. So basically, less than a week after the crime happened, you had 2 mainstream media platforms boosting, broadcasting, supporting, reinforcing a serial killer theory, right? So that is how you shape or misshape, interpret or misinterpret, get the right note to your true crime symphony or get the wrong note. And so if the media are talking about a serial killer, what do you think law enforcement are doing? Law enforcement are going to be paying attention to media and social media as well. That's also going to influence their thinking. So this was the actual article. Let me bring it up here. Let's show it to you. It's this article from the Sun, the US Sun, and it was this article dated November 19, horror rampage. Interesting, the choice of words there. University of Idaho murder massacre. So there's another word, massacre, rampage. Gainesville Ripper, who was a serial killer who inspired Scream movies, expert says. Now, if you just take this headline, the headline itself is very confusing and contradictory if you a true crime analyst, if you trying to apply a definition, because it's referring to a rampage, it's referring to a murder massacre, which almost sounds like a mass murder, right? And then the Gainesville Ripper, who is a serial killer. So just in terms of this headline, it seems to be conflating 3 different definitions, right? If you go through the article, it sort of refers to this Gainesville Ripper, who's basically a serial killer. Danny Rolling is a serial killer. And a special type of serial killer who was a very sadistic person who there was a sexual component to all of his crimes, and a burglary aspect often as well, breaking and entering, in a weird way, a Jeffrey Dahmer type situation as well, where he would pose his victims and he would do really horrible things in the same way that Jeffrey Dahmer did. Are we really talking about the same kind of killer in this case? Did this killer do that? Well, this killer left two survivors, so that alone is quite different, right? Anyway, the expert that provided this assessment is a former medical examiner, a guy called Joseph Scott Morgan. And so that is really where it starts. You've got an expert who very early on says, you know what, this crime reminds me of the Danny Rolling case. And then the true crime community take that as gospel. And then you're going to kind of just ask a couple of questions. The obvious question is, did the person who committed this crime do the thing that Danny Rolling did, which is force his way in, breaking an entry, burgle? Did he burgle? Is there any element in terms of the victimology that's similar besides the fact that he used a knife and they were students? And the answer is actually no. There's a lot that is different besides the simple things that are true, students and knife. And the most obvious thing that's different is, and what's quite idiosyncratic here, is that the perpetrator here, there was no forced entry. There's no forced entry. What does that mean, though? What does that mean if there's no forced entry? Let me say that again. What does it mean if there's no forced entry? Let's see where our poll is. 43% say rampage killer. Serial killer is now up to 13%. Mass murderer, 23%. Spree killer, 21%. So I am going to deal with the definitions, and then that should provide you with a better idea of what we're talking about. So as I say, the Sun provided this assessment. The Daily Mail then repeated it, the same kind of expert assessment, and they said the following, quote, a crime expert is now comparing the grisly murders of the University of Idaho students to the Gainesville Ripper from 1990. That is a coded way of saying an expert is comparing this crime and thus, by inference, this criminal to a serial killer. Well, is that accurate? Thanks a lot, humble grower. Is that accurate? And then they say, Joseph Scott Morgan, a professor of applied forensics, sounds very like a real expert, somebody who really knows what he's talking about, a really credible person. He's at Jacksonville State University. He told an outlet that he believes the murders are reminiscent, quite a big word, reminiscent, of the crimes that sent shock and panic through Gainesville, Florida in 1990. It's quite strange that he's going back to 32 years ago to say a crime that happened 32 years ago, that reminds me of this crime. Isn't there maybe something that's a little bit more current? Like how about the Delphi case, which is current right now, which also involves stabbing two people at the same time, right? Did the Delphi killer know his victims? That's kind of a current case. You can apply some of the true crime psychology, criminal psychology to that here. Marcus, I'm glad. I know you did say I do all my lives when you're asleep, so I'm glad that I could do this while you're awake. So here we go. Thanks for that. Okay, so he told the U.S. Sun, I remember back then the parents were terrified at the University of Florida because of this. And so that seems to be how he's making the comparison. He's kind of going, I remember when there were murders of students and the parents were terrified. Parents are terrified here. So does that mean it's the same kind of crime? But that was a serial killer and serial killings. And I mean, the parents are terrified in this case. And we've actually just heard the father, here it is, the father of Kaylee talking about big open wounds and calling the police cowards. That's just come out. So yeah, the police are upset and angry. But can you say the crimes are similar because the families are terrified? You had the same thing with the JonBenet Ramsey case. if the families are terrified and parents are terrified, are you dealing with the same case? Obviously not, right? So that seems a little bit of a incomplete way of making a comparison, doesn't it? I mean, I'm asking the question. Okay, so let's deal with another expert. I just want to make another comment. When this particular expert was asked to comment on an image of the blood dripping down a wall, right? We all know about that image, and it is a very troubling image. It's providing a little symptom, a small glimpse of something terrible, something horrible, brutal, obviously excruciatingly painful, something on the face of it unfathomable. But basically, we're talking about a bloodbath, we're talking about bloodshed, we're talking about, that. And so he was asked to comment on that, and he said, I thought it was striking. Quite a strange word. It's almost like the word is the actual deed, because that is what is happening, striking with a knife, right? And then he also said, I don't know that I have sufficient verbiage for that. And maybe I'm nitpicking, but I am an author, and I am someone who pays attention to semantics. And whether it's a criminal saying certain things that stand out or an expert saying certain things, I do sort of wonder, wow, verbiage. I don't have the verbiage to I don't have sufficient verbiage for that. Verbiage is a big, intelligent sounding word to say, I'm not sure what you say about that. I'm shocked or whatever. Ironically, the word verbosity means to try to sound excessively technical when confronted with a basic idea. And you can sound very clever and very intelligent talking about the definitions of serial killings and mass murder and so on. You can sound like you're a true crime genius, or you can simply Google it and check the definitions on Wikipedia. You don't need to be a rocket scientist. You don't need to be a professor. You just need to be someone who is curious and pays attention and kind of finds out for yourself, what is the definition of a serial killer? Okay, that's it. And we're going to deal with it. What is the definition of a spree killer? Okay, that's it. And then what do we see in this case that fits into either of those definitions? Do you need to be a professor or an expert to do that? Or do you just need to understand the English language fairly well and have a little bit of a sense of analysis where you go, okay, so that's the definition and this is what we're dealing with, which one fits the best? You just need to use a little bit of logic and common sense, don't you? Lawrence is either knowledgeable about property and or tenants. Not sure what that's referring to. But are you guys following where I'm coming from? So anyway, this expert was suggesting that the Idaho student murders, by conflating it with the Gainesville thing, he was suggesting that the Idaho student murders were the work of a serial killer, specifically Danny Rolling. Now, if that expert says, you know what, you're misquoting me, that's not what I said, that is certainly what a lot of people who heard that or read that took from that, because they came to my channel and they said, I think it's a serial killer. And people asked me specifically to, Nick, will you please go and look at the Gainesville serial killer, and because I think that's related. That's how they took it. And so that is where that came from. So it's not me saying that that's what they thought, it's what many of you thought. And it's something that came up in the media as well. And I think some journalists did ask, is this the work of a serial killer? Where do you think that came from? Where do you think that came from? But anyway, there's more. About 5 days after this, so you get the serial killer idea coming into this true crime case. And then 5 days later, a second expert also reiterates the serial killer label. This time it's Ted Bundy. This time it's, oh, this guy reminds me of Ted Bundy. This crime reminds me of Ted Bundy. Right? And once again, similar to Ted Bundy's feverish Florida rampage. There's the word rampage again. So hang on, what are we talking about? Is it a rampage or a serial killer? Or is it a serial killer in the middle of a rampage? What are we really dealing with? I've got to tell you that the first person that came to my mind wasn't Ted Bundy. When I thought about this, the first person that came to mind when I heard about this was actually Henry van Breda, a guy, an axe murderer who killed his family. That was the first person who came to mind. And the first sort of emotion that came to mind was, is this about jealousy? Is this about an immature, jealous man? A sort of young 20-year-old, immature, jealous person who loses his temper over something that he really shouldn't. What sort of person gets really upset over what someone else might consider small or not really that important? Well, someone with a low self-image of any age, and someone who's also immature, which could also be any age, but you'd be particularly susceptible to that if you were a young man. And what makes sense? Who is more likely to wield an axe, a young man or a young woman on somebody else? Because there was also a young woman in that house. So could the young woman have wielded the axe? No, she was actually almost killed as well. It was Henry's sister, right? So that was the case that stood out to me, not serial killers and Ted Bundy. And as soon as you start to think that this case could be a serial killer, aren't you sensationalizing it? Aren't you turning something that's already horrific into something even worse, but needlessly so? And that's why I say you've got to be very careful diagnosing the right way, because you can add to panic, you can add to fear, you can add to trauma, but you're doing so unnecessarily. So are you as an expert speculating recklessly as well? What's going on? So that's something I try very hard to be real about, is when a crime happens, to not make it any worse than it already is, to try and be real about it, to say, okay, so this is what we're dealing with. Not to try to see it as worse or less bad than it is, but to simply see it for what it is, right? That to me is the challenge in every case. I wonder if I must put on my beanie. To me, you've messed up the focus. Is that going to work? Is that going to work? Not quite sure what has happened now, but the focus is now not working. Timmy, I think you must come back. Come, boy. Timmy, I need you. Come, boy, come. Hey, come up. It's summer here, so it actually gets quite sweaty. Keeping the dog on my lap. So yeah, and even sweatier wearing a beanie. But anyway, there we go. Well, focus is back. Okay. Right. So according to this article from Fox News, there you can see the date, or can you see the date? Let me bring it up. There's the date, 24th of November. It was 4 days after the other article, basically referring to a serial killer. And this is also talking about similarities with the Gainesville Ripper, but then also mentioning Ted Bundy. There it is, Ted Bundy's homicidal attack, right? And so now we've got two serial killers that are sort of being associated with this killer. So is that right? Are there other crimes that this person's committed, right? So far, the police have said no. And to be honest, just this crime in isolation to me doesn't feel like that, because you would imagine a serial killer who's kind of an advanced criminal a particularly psychopathic, vicious criminal, why would he allow two survivors and the dog to survive? Right? Why would he do that? So I just want to address what Marcus says. Fox News is not a reliable news outlet. Fox News, it doesn't really matter. It can be Fox News, it can be Daily Mail, it can be The Sun. All they are doing is repeating what an expert's saying. So you shouldn't really attack the news source, the news platform. You should look at simply what they're saying. They are like just an echo chamber. And so they're simply saying what an expert's saying. And then the question is what the expert's saying credible or valid or not? And the same applies on YouTube channels. Some YouTube channels echo things that we all know better than others. So that's really how you need to think about it. That's how I think about it. Matey Davis is sadistic male. There is a lot of sadism here, and Katie's father actually mentions that word here as well. He says, where is it? Sadistic male, yeah. Those are Katie's father's words. Okay. Right. So according to Fox News, this expert, a guy called Matt Hoggett, a retired criminal investigator with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department in Mississippi, he said Bundy had knowledge of the victims in the house, and it was sort of a frenzied attack with extreme violence. That actually sounds right, doesn't it? Don't you guys agree with that? It feels like our perpetrator had knowledge of the victims in the house. It also feels like it was a sort of frenzied attack with extreme violence. I do think you've got to be careful with the extreme violence. What exactly are we talking about with extreme violence? Is there only physical violence, or is there physical and sexual violence? Is there extreme violence and taking souvenirs, as you saw with the Delphi case? Was there any souvenir taking in this case? I doubt it. I doubt that there was souvenir taking. Right? So although this is dealing with a serial killer, it's dealing with one particular incident in a serial killer's repertoire. Of course, there's a lot more to Ted Bundy, and he had lots of different types of attacks in different scenarios. This is one scenario that the person's sort of cherry picking and saying, oh, that was just the same. I'd also be interested to know at what point in his serial killing career did he commit this particular crime, right? But anyway, the issue is, it's once again thinking about someone who's not a student, right? So in both these cases, Danny Rolling and Ted Bundy, neither of them are students. Whereas don't you think that the perpetrator in this case is a student? Terry says, welcome all joining in our critical conversation. So let me ask you guys that question. Do you think the perpetrator is a student? Yes or no? That's a great point from Josephine. I agree with that 100%. Sexual activity had not taken place and has been stated from the onset. I think the medical examiner said there was no essay on any of the victims. So why put that in people's minds? Well, it's not relevant. And so that's a major area of disagreement where you say, yeah, but Ted Bundy, there's a big sexual element to those crimes. In fact, that's probably why he committed the crimes. And Danny Rawlings as well, big sexual element. Was there any kind of sexual element in these crimes? Not nearly as central as with those serial killers, but I think there was an element to that in the fabric of the crime, but certainly not centrally. Do you guys agree with that? So some of you say yes, some say probably, someone says it was a professor. Okay, so let me address that. One reason why I would think it's not a professor, it's not a bad guess, because there was an incident like that. But bear in mind, the students are different age groups. The one set of students are 20 years old, Ethan and Xana, and the others are 21 years old. You might think that's not very relevant, but obviously if you 1 year older, well, then you are leaving university, or you could be. If you a year younger or 2 years younger, well, you're not finished with your university career. But the point is, you may be in different classes. So it's not one professor to all four students. Just in that aspect, I think it's worth thinking about it like that. Yeah, 20 and 21. One profiler said there's always a sexual element. I think that is well stated. I do think there's a sexual element to this crime, but it gets overtaken by something else, emasculation. It starts off with a sexual pursuit. You end up being emasculated. It starts off with something, maybe it becomes jealousy. It ends up being anger. So the primary drive is not the sexual impulse, but it's actually anger, right? Frustration. Okay, so Hoggett's appraisal, in my opinion, is better and closer than Morgan's. In my view, this is my opinion. But it also envisions the criminal as a serial killer, which means his connection with the victims is closer to a stranger than to an ex-boyfriend or friend or someone otherwise quite familiar with the house. So do you guys agree with that? Do you guys agree that if you're talking about a serial killer, you are more likely talking about a stranger than a friend, boyfriend, or someone that's sort of quite familiar? Do you guys agree with that? So let's look at the poll. We are now at rampage killer down to 40%, serial killer up to 15%. It's come up from about 10%. It's still the lowest of all four of those options. Mass murderer is second. Second at 25%. Okay. Fox News also muddies the definitions that we need to work with here by saying the following. This is quoting from Fox News. Let me just take that away. I'm just going to do this. Okay. Someone says could be a drug hit. Okay. So according to Fox News, quote, the University of Idaho murders share eerie similarities with Ted Bundy's homicidal attack on the Chi Omega sorority, I don't know if I'm saying it right, and Danny Rawlings' killing spree in a Florida college town, experts say. Now, just think about that. I don't know if you heard what I said there. Ted Bundy and Danny Rawlings were serial killers, so why is the word spree in there? Why do you have the word spree in the middle of talking about serial killers? Because a spree killer is something else entirely. In the Chris Watts case, we saw a similar misdiagnosis of the crime as a family annihilation, or Chris Watts is a family annihilator. And I think there might actually be some of you here, and tell me if that's the case. Is there anyone here who thinks that Chris Watts is a family annihilator? Is there anyone here who thinks that Chris Watts, that what happened in the Watts family was a family annihilation? Is there anyone who thinks that? Right? If you do think that, and you push that definition to one side, and you say, okay, so here is Chris Watts. We know what he's like. We know who he is. Is he is he a prototypical family annihilator? So in other words, we define the Watts family murders as a annihilation by an annihilator, right? Then you say, well, here is Chris Watts. Here he is. We know him very well by now. Is Chris Watts a prototypical family annihilator? Then what do you say? Do you say, yes, he is? So let me say that again. Is the definition of the Watts crime, does that fit the criminal? Does that fit the criminal? Shall I say that again? First of all, do you accept that the Watts family murders were an annihilation? So you say, maybe, you say, yes. Then you say, okay, so that's the definition of what happened there. So is Chris Watts a family annihilator? As a type of criminal, is he a family annihilator? Then do you say, yes, he is? Then you say, okay, but what is a family annihilator? What is the definition of a family annihilator? What is the prototypical definition of a family annihilator? And what is that? Let me bring it up. Okay, so this is quite a good thing to look at. I think this is really going to do a good job of trying to address what I'm talking about here. Okay, so if you talk, so family annihilator, if you Google it, you get familicide, right? It says a type of murder or murder-suicide in which one kills multiple close family people, and the crime may be referred as family annihilation. So that's one description. Here's another one. In 90% of the cases, the family annihilator is a male offender, check, coming from a good, respectable family with no criminal record. Let's say, arguably, check. He's usually between 30 and 40, check. So there we go. We've got quite a good psychological profile there for family annihilator. But let's not stop there. One family member murders other members of their family, commonly taking the lives of all. Check, right? And then we go to this one. Where is it? Thought I saw it here. Anyway, the part to take note of is murder-suicide. Often family annihilators kill themselves. That is a typical thing in family murders, taking the lives of all. I thought I actually saw it here where they say the act of killing his or own relatives. See if we can bring up another one. Okay, so anyway, the point is, part of the sort of strict definition of a family annihilator is that they often take their own lives. It's kind of a murder-suicide in the same way that mass killers or mass shooters kill lots of people. It's kind of within the act of taking their own lives. It's kind of a extended version of suicide, right? Does Chris Watts fit that definition? Actually, what Chris Watts is doing is he's wanting to live his fairy tale. He's not wanting to end his life, he's wanting to start his life, right? So it doesn't actually fit the proper definition of annihilation, where you want to kill your family and then go to heaven instantly and avoid death and all that sort of thing. This is taking his family out so that he can have a new family. That's not a typical annihilation. And if you paid attention to the Watts case and paid attention to what the investigators said, they would have told you Chris Watts is a very unusual criminal because he's kind of a nice guy. He's kind of a soft-spoken, kind person. He's not really a very aggressive person. He's kind of a nice guy, yeah, all of those things. So he really doesn't fit the profile of what you would imagine an annihilator would be. I think there's a certain religious element to annihilators as well, where they think, well, I want to be in heaven with my family, so that's what I'm going to do. Chris Watts, I don't think that played into his thinking at all. Yeah, so as Paula says, Watts is not your typical annihilator. But if you start your investigation of the Chris Watts case with family annihilation and annihilator in your mind, then that is going to be the wrong note that ruins the whole symphony. That is going to, in a way, warp your entire figuring out of Chris Watts, right? Because you've either chosen the wrong definition or you've stuck too religiously to a definition that's not quite right. The exact same thing applies here, right? Yeah, I must say it does feel a bit like the murder of Mo Wilson, this case. It does feel a little bit like that. So can you see how important it is to just make sure that your first step in a true crime investigation, which is defining the crime, defining the type of crime and thus the type of criminal and thus the profile for that person. Can you see how important it is to get that first detail right, right? So can you see why a serial killer isn't going to work here for quite a few reasons? So that's already a mistake and a step in the wrong direction. So what is a step kind of in the right direction? Let me play back this thing about when a note is off, it destroys the whole symphony.
Shelley, when one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
Did you catch that? I didn't put my earphones in, so if you didn't, not sure if you did, but so how do we get the note right so that it doesn't destroy the whole symphony? What is the right note in this case? So for starters, it's not a serial killer. Besides that, as far as we know, there was no SA in the Idaho slaying, whereas it was present in many, if not most, of Rowling's and Bundy's victims, as I said earlier. One also has a sense that SA was the main motive of the Delphi case. Do you guys agree with that statement? Or do you think that that's just an incorrect statement? Do you agree that the main motive in the Delphi case was SA, not murder? Murder was a byproduct of what the original motive was. The thing that the killer wanted more than anything in the Delphi case was SA, was a sexual aspect, right? The murder was an unfortunate way of dealing with the fact that SA had happened and everything else, the taboo factor, right? Do you agree with that? So then you've got to kind of ask yourself, well, do you think SA was the primary deal here? And I think the answer is obviously no, because there wasn't any SA, which is also the primary thing with many serial killers, certainly the ones cited by these experts. So that's quite strange. We're dealing with a crime that probably has a sexual element, yet sex is not present in the actual execution of the crime. So what are we dealing with here? Charlotte Stahlberg says, what is a rampage murder? I will define that for you in a moment. Bundy says, sorry, this was a sex-based attack also. What we mean is, did the perpetrator commit a sexual act? And the answer is no. Well, certainly as far as we know, no. Was there a sexual element? Was there, was there a sexual element that brought this person into the orbit of the victims and vice versa? Very likely. But in terms of committing the crime, I think it was the crime itself was giving up, acknowledging the giving up of that sexual aspect, if you guys follow my meaning. Okay. So whereas the sexual violence, it's not just sex, it's sexual violence, was a primary motive with Rowling and Bundy, maybe with Richard Allen, it wasn't a motive here. Do you guys agree with that? Sexual violence wasn't a motive here. Sex played a role, just as it did in the Chris Watts case. In the Watts case, 3 people paid the price because someone had the perception that they were getting in the way of a potentially exciting sexual adventure. In this case, you may have something similar. Someone paid the price because someone had the perception that they weren't getting to have an exciting sexual adventure that they thought they could have had. And I don't know if it's premature to say this. I don't know if it's distasteful to say this, but it's something that I've considered. The thought is sort of, I've glimpsed the thought and I've seen 1 or 2 people mention it as well. I do wonder whether the perpetrator was thinking about a threesome. I do wonder whether the perpetrator had that idea somewhere in the whole thing. What do I know more than that? Not much. Is it very, very likely? I'm not sure if it's very, very likely. Is it possible? I think it's possible. I think it's worth mentioning. I think that is in the ether. I mean, when kids are at that age at university, you can have certain experimental type behavior. Did this person think that something on the sexual scale, something quite incredible on the sexual scale in terms of a sexual adventure, was he was on the precipice of being invited into that or something like that, and then only to be, ha ha ha, sorry, we were just joking. Was it something like that, or was it something else? The I'm just saying it because there is somewhat of a perception of that, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that. Whether that's going to take you anywhere is a different story. Is there going to be any reinforcement for that on one or either of the victims' phones? Maybe, maybe not. Is there any reinforcement for that in the social media? There seems to be, possibly. It's hard to say. It's difficult to say. So I've referred to 2 experts. Sorry, I must say it, not spray it. 2 expert assessments that I disagree with. So whose assessment do I agree with? Well, this one. It's from Tracy Walder. She's a former FBI special agent. And let me play the clip, see if I can find it. I think it's over here.
I actually think that it's highly possible that he is integrated himself back into the community. What the
Former FBI special agent believes the suspect is someone familiar with the property. Former FBI special on Monday. One former FBI special agent believes the suspect is someone familiar with the property.
I actually think that it's highly possible that he is integrated himself back into the community. What this person did, I'm going to say he because my gut tells me that it is a male. What this person tells me is yes, they are very much a cold-hearted killer.
Police have yet to publicly name any.
So that's not quite what I want to sort of talk about in terms of what she's saying. It's basically that when she says that killer's integrated himself back, well, you would imagine what she means is it's a student. It's a student that stepped out of his role as a student, became a killer, and now is a student again, right? It's not a serial killer who was never a student and then who goes on to somewhere else. But the important part is actually the part that the reporter says, where she says it's a person familiar, right? Which is another way of saying it's someone who is a contemporary, someone who is on the same status level. In other words, part of the same society, a student, that was familiar enough to know the keypad, or familiar enough to know the inside of the house, or familiar enough to know who slept where. That's the kind of person we're talking about, someone familiar. Now, suppose you could color not inside that line and color slightly beyond that line and say, were the party goers at that house 100% students and only students and nothing but students? Was every single party goer, every single time they had a party, a student? And I think the possibility is maybe occasionally there was someone who wasn't. Maybe there was someone who was a supplier or a friend or a family member, a cousin or something, who wasn't a student who was associated with some of these parties. That's possible. So in other words, you could have familiarity in that quite personal way that is somewhat indirect. And maybe because we are fixated on students, we can't see the familiarity be slightly beyond that. It's familiar, but not tightly familiar, not obviously familiar, right? Yeah, so that's also quite interesting. Also, this idea that you can kill 4 people but not kill 2 others suggests quite a flexible psychology in a way. So anyway, she says, I actually think it's highly possible that he integrated himself back into the community. Now think about that idea. Let me put those words up. These are the words of former FBI Special Agent Tracy Walder. Think about those words and this idea of there's a killer on the loose. It's not only there's a killer on the loose, it's potentially there's a killer in our midst. That I remember when I was at university, literally in the law class, sitting in the law class, the professor said, look left, look right. Only one of you is going to be here in whatever it was, 3 or 4 years, right? It's kind of the same thing. Look left, look right. One of you might be a killer. And so that killer has possibly integrated himself back into the community. What this person did, these are again Tracy Walder's words, and I'm going to say it because my gut tells me it's a male. It's a he, and he's a cold-hearted killer. I don't think that's rocket science. I think is obviously a he. I think there's a possibility that it could be a she. And if you're talking about same-sex relationships, a she could feel like the odd one out. Actually, I love you, and we're not looking for a male spurned ex-boyfriend, could be a female. Suppose that's also possible. But just the type of crime and the brazenness of it and the type of weapon doesn't suggest that. Okay, so the part that I agree with is where she's introduced and that the killer is familiar with the property and the people inside it. So I've written here, is it too soon or too late to ponder whether the killer considered or imagined a threesome with 2 of the victims? Did one of the victims block him from seeing one and from seeing the other? Now, I've kind of, some people don't like this, that they say it's like circular reasoning and you're not really dealing with anything. But I kind of have a, let's just do that. I kind of have a thing where intuitively you are thinking about something which, although that's not true, that specific thing's not true, it is taking you to something else that you're not aware of yet that is true. So you might say the threesome thing is a joke, it's ridiculous, it's not accurate, it's not part of the fabric here, and it might be true. But if you think about what we spoke about previously, gratuitousness as part of this crime, So there's gratuitous violence in terms of this crime. So was there gratuitous sex on the other side, or the promise of gratuitous sex? Or what does the promise of gratuitous sex possibly involve? Well, it might involve a threesome. It might involve something that's not a threesome, but is nevertheless gratuitous. What is that? Maybe it's borrowing someone's girlfriend, or I don't know, whatever it is. I think there are quite a few permutations. But the point is, isn't there something in a sexual sense that's gratuitous that someone thought that they could participate in and were very, very disappointed that they couldn't? And let's bear in mind, when you are 20 years old, you can get very excited and you can get your hopes very high up on certain things that are very irrational and certain things that are somewhat rational. You might think that you love someone and that you're going to live happily ever after forever, and I will love you forever. And that's not very realistic, but you might nevertheless feel that way with great certainty as a young person. I think a lot of people at that age, you feel so strongly about something that you feel, I will love you forever and I will never ever forget you. And then maybe a month later, you've got a different boyfriend or girlfriend. But those feelings are extremely strong, and they're very real. And at the same time, being denied some of those irrational feelings also evokes and provokes strong feelings, especially if you're pretty immature to begin with. So the threesome thing may not be the thing, but it's pointing to something that may be the thing. Something that was gratuitous. Could be drugs, it could be drugs and sex, it could be sex of a gratuitous nature, but nevertheless meant something to somebody. Okay, so what is the TCRS? This is not coming to the point. What is the TCRS assessment for defining this crime? I've kind of nitpicked and said it's not this and it's not that, and that guy wasn't completely right. So what do you say it is? What is the definition? What are the definitions? What is your definition? So that's what we're going to deal with now. Let's go through the quiz right now. I see we had 437 votes. Make sure you vote if you haven't. So we still at 41% saying rampage killer. Serial killer is at 14% now, mass murder at 25%. Mass murder and spree killer are sort of almost at the same level. Okay. So the TCRS assessment is, number one, it's not a serial killer. Although if it is an incel scenario, so I'm leaving the door open to that. There could be an incel scenario. And what is an incel scenario? It's someone who is involuntarily celibate. And I think that is a terrible situation to be in at university, to be involuntarily celibate. Like everyone is getting laid except me, and I just can't, I don't know what to do. I just can't get out of that, right? That must be a horrible place to be. And I think that could be part of what we're dealing with here. So it's not a serial killer, but if it is an incel scenario, we could see a follow-up crime. And that is why I even think law enforcement believe that. That's why they said, stay vigilant, move in groups, because there could be a follow-up incident. So the other thing to say is it's not a serial killer, but you could also say not yet or not right now /?, right? That's not what I'm saying, though. I'm saying it's not a serial killer, but it could be an incel scenario, and we might see a follow-up crime, but I don't think we will. In my opinion, we won't. So I'm kind of saying it's not a serial killer. There could be an incel component. If there is, and if it's strong enough, there could be another offense, but in my opinion, we won't. So I'm saying it's not a serial killer. It could be an incel, but I don't think it is, in terms of the type of incel attacks that we've seen. I don't think it's kind of going to go quite that far. I think the person is going to be caught and arrested before he can commit another crime, quite frankly. Anyway, that's the first point. It's not a serial killer. Okay. Second point, it's a personal targeted attack. So if it's not a serial killer, who are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with someone somewhat familiar with the inside of the house and the people inside the house. And that's the part that is still a bit of a mystery. How familiar? So we're saying it's someone familiar. Well, how familiar? Familiar with who? Familiar with the two girls upstairs or the couple on the sort of middle floor? How familiar are we talking about? So number two, it's a personal targeted attack. And I'm saying likely the attack was on Kaylee or Madison or both. Now, if you take what Kaylee's father, and one's heart's got to go out to him, where he's, I mean, I think just yesterday I was saying we haven't really heard much from him. Maybe he's towing the line with law enforcement, or maybe expects an arrest at any moment. Well, maybe not, because he's just called the police cowards and spoken in a bit more detail about the wounds that poor Kaylee suffered, right? So was Kaylee the main target? I think this is brought up in this video. I think this is brought up in this video. Let's play it quickly.
Well, if that is the case, I think that's one avenue that's being explored. I think all avenues are being explored. I think there's a lot of work being done in this case. There's a tremendous amount of leads that are coming in to be being explored. If that is the case,
killer's main target. Injuries suggesting perhaps she was the killer's main target.
well, if that is the case, I think that's one avenue that's being explored. I think all avenues are being explored. I think there's a lot of work being done in this case. There's a tremendous amount of leads that are coming in to be covered. So yes, I think that's one. I wouldn't say that's the only one. I don't know because I'm not privy to the inside of the investigation, and none of us are, and none of us should be. The only information that should be coming out should be information that's relevant to the public safety.
Okay, so this FBI agent is asked, do you think Kaylee is the primary target? And he says, well, that's just one angle of it. And although he's right, I think you've got to acknowledge that certainly from the media's side, and I think social media to some extent, and her father, there's this idea, Kaylee keeps coming up as an idea that she is the primary target. And I've been going from Madison to Kaylee to Madison, and they're fairly good arguments, I think, for both. But right now, I'm sort of a little bit more on the Kaylee side of the fence, I think, because of a couple of reasons. Kaylee's social media was a lot more suggestive. Kaylee was doing things that the others weren't doing. For example, she just bought a car. She's moved out the house already. Something else that you could say is her father is quite verbal and quite involved in this case. Is that sign, that personality evident with her, right? And does that have any role in any of this? Did she, and I don't want to blame her, I'm simply saying, did she say something that antagonized someone? And it's the same question that this is not, this is looking at it from the criminal's perspective. What triggered the criminal? Was it something that Madison said or something that Kaylee said? That's not to blame either Madison or Kaylee, simply to ask what got the killer's attention. And I think a lot of people don't like thinking of it that way. but you're trying to get into the killer's mind. So the question is, who got under the killer's skin and why, right? What frustrated the killer or attracted the killer or made the killer angry or whatever it is. And that doesn't mean that the crime's justified. It means that's the criminal psychology that caused the crime to happen. That's what it means. That's what we're thinking about. And so the thing is that I don't really accept is this idea that if Kaylee's wounds were worse, I don't know if that necessarily means she's the primary victim in a scenario like this. So I have dealt with cases that I've studied where there are multiple victims, such as in South Africa, Henry van Bredal, the axe murders. I think his brother got the worst injuries and the worst suffering. And I think he was the primary target. And so I think in that case, that thinking works, is sound. There's another case where a 16-year-old, I think he was actually 15 at the time, shot to death his sister and parents, also in South Africa. His sister bore the brunt of that violence. And it really did seem like he did have a bone to pick with his sister. I think his sister had revealed a very intimate and taboo secret. And so he took out his feelings on her. But I don't know if that's the case here, because there wouldn't be time really to do that. You would be in the middle of executing your crime when you would wake up the victim right next to that person. And you also have the issue of, if that person's woken up, then there's going to be a defensive scenario going on. The person that you attack first, even though that's your primary victim, is going to then, how can I put it, rouse the next victim, who's going to have more of an opportunity to fight back, which means you might have more wounding and more defensive wounds. I suppose you could argue that if the killer was particularly upset with one of the victims, that there would be something idiosyncratic, not so much stabbing wounds, but something else. I suppose that's possible. There could even be stab the one seriously, stab the other one seriously, and then go back to the original target. That could also be the case. We tend to think about things very simply and kind of chronologically, but you could literally have that situation playing out. Okay, so do you guys agree that it feels like it's more likely to be Kaylee or Madison or both than Ethan and Xana? Like, do you guys agree that a month later, it feels like we're at that point? There seems to be more reason to believe that either Kaylee or Madison were the primary target. There just seems to be more substance around that than Ethan and Xana. Or do you think you can't say that? Kentucky says, not at all, not enough information. Actually says, not really, I don't know. Bridge Creek says, probably, but by no means certain. Donald says the blonde factor. That's a man speaking a man's language. And I think there's some truth to that. So I want to quickly bring something up in terms of that. I have before. If you're talking about what is the difference between Kaylee and Maddie, and you can either take the grub truck situation, or you can say, let's just use that as an analogy for some other situation that we don't know. And you say, look at what happened there where Maddie's swearing at someone and she's quite silly and quite cute. And Kaylee then steps away and records her doing that. Who is going to be possibly offended not in that particular situation, but in a situation like that, somewhere else, by the person saying fuck you, or the person recording that person saying fuck you and giggling. It's kind of quite a tough question in a way. I suppose it's subjective. Some people may feel, I don't like you saying that to me and pointing to me, but someone else might say, I don't like you recording that, because what you're going to do with it? Are you going to send it to your friends? Are you going to humiliate me, right? And maybe that person's done it before. Then there's a third scenario, which is where it's not either or, where it's a unit, as somebody said. It's a unit who are, yeah, there it is from 0, where they are both equally fun-loving and just enjoying one another's company. Whereas the person who is pursuing one of them feels doubly ostracized and humiliated, because it's one person rejecting you, but the other person sort of enjoying it and laughing at it and finding it amusing. But can you see how that can make a singular rejection twice as bad for someone who's immature or something like that? I don't know if that's true, Elsa Foda. I don't know if that's news to me. That's news to me. Okay. So I've so far said, what is the TCRS assessment for defining this crime? Number 1, it's not a serial killer. Number 2, it's a personal targeted attack. And then I've expanded on that to say, I think it is more likely an attack on Kaylee. It could be Madison. It could also be both. Almost both of them equally. So the targets were 2 people. It could also be that the killer felt jealous or envious of the closeness of their relationship. He wanted a relationship with one of them, but they had a relationship with each other, either a romantic relationship or a friendship, and somehow it excluded him. And I think this is the bottom line to this whole case. I think this statement is the bottom line to this whole case. Somehow it excluded him. Well, how? How exactly? Well, we don't know. How can you find out? Well, by looking at their phones, by looking at the dynamics of each student with their orbit, by looking at their love lives, by looking at the parties, by looking at the people, by the survivors. I think the biggest clues can be provided by the survivors. Who is coming into that house? What is the vibe inside that house? Was anyone in that house having relationships? Who is the last person in that house that had a relationship with someone in that house? So obviously not Ethan, but who was the last person in that house that slept over in that house that no longer did after that? I think that's quite an important question to ask. Somehow it excluded him. In what way? That's the question that needs to be answered. If there was a same-sex relationship going on and the killer was attracted to either individual, he may have felt justified in killing both, because both were responsible for his emasculation in terms of his criminal psychology. Okay. I need to drink some water. So number 3, this is the third aspect to my assessment for defining this crime. I feel that the crime most closely matches a spree killing. And this is where we're going to deal with the definitions, right? And so what's quite interesting is spree killing as the second least votes from you guys. 20% vote for spree killer. So let's go through it now. Looks like every one of you have voted, 521 votes. Serial killer, 13%. Don't think it's that. Mass murderer, 25%. that's a better answer. Spree killer, 20%. I think that's a better answer than mass murderer. And then rampage killer, 42%. Now, let's go through this. I think that the crime most closely matches a spree killing, although technically it's not that either, right? There was a rampage, and more than 2 murders were committed over a short period. But the third and fourth murders weren't committed in multiple locations. And that's part of the definition of a spree killing. You need the third and fourth murders at multiple locations. Unless you want to argue that going from one floor and one room to another is multiple locations, but actually it's not. Even so, the latter part of the US Bureau of Justice Statistics definition is a perfect match for a spree killing. So this is the US Bureau of Justice Statistics definition of a spree killing. It is killings at 2 or more locations with almost no time break between murders. So what I'm trying to say is that the second part of that sentence is a perfect description for this crime. In other words, no time break between murders. In other words, 4 people are murdered and there's almost no break between those 4 murders, right? What's quite important with what we're doing now is when you say it's not a serial killer with some degree of certainty and educated certainty, and you say it's not this and it's not that, then you can take those cases away as being not intertextual. In terms of true crime intertextuality, you can take those away and you can say, let's not look at Ted Bundy. He's not a student, and so on and so on. Let's not look at this other guy. You can also look at those cases and say, why is that case not like this case? You can do that. But what's valuable with defining it properly is you can then look at actual spree killings and spree killers and say, oh, so this is the kind of person we're dealing with. Statistically, we're dealing with someone of this age, someone who's more likely, whatever, a male or a female, someone who more likely uses a knife or a gun or whatever, and someone who more likely is angry or humiliated or whatever it is. And so, in other words, you can apply intertextuality in terms of the light over the gravel road in a very targeted way. You can say, let's look at spree killers and let's get our profile from spree killers. Let's pertinently look at student spree killers, right? Do you see where I'm coming from? Okay. So the main idiosyncrasy of a spree killer is no cooling off period. That's the main problem with this case and a serial killer. Serial killers have cooling off periods. Let me just put that up again with an idiosyncrasy. There we go. So the main idiosyncrasy is no cooling off period. And that's, as I say, typical of serial killers. Mass murderers are defined by one incident. And you might say, but hold on, this is that. This is one incident. I personally don't think the opposite profile of our killer fits the mass murderer profile of mass shooters, right? Mass murderers tend to be mass shooters, and mass murderers tend to be suicidal. And we don't have either of those cases here. So can you see how there's a very fine line where you can say it's this but not that, but hold on, that doesn't strictly fit into that either, but that and but that. Can you see how it's, you might say it's a semantic game and it's not neither here nor there, but actually it's the first step you actually need to take is define this crime accurately. And you need to spend some time doing that. Do you feel you've come closer to being able to define this crime, what it isn't, but also what it is? Do you feel like you've made that process personally within this discussion, because then it would have been a success. Let me put that up. Mass murderers are defined by one incident, which is what this feels like. And although this is that, it's not the appropriate profile, because mass murderers are often shooters and suicidal, and that's not what we have in this case. They also aren't afraid to show who they are. In fact, they want, I mean, that's a big part of it. Mass shooters want everyone to know who they are, and they want their name in the headlines, and they write a manifesto. None of that is the case here. Can you see how it's very different to that? Yvonne says, I understand what it isn't more than what it is. Well, that's a start. So let's go back to our poll. So if you said mass murderer, that although that's more than spree killer, I wouldn't agree with you. It's definitely not a serial killer. It's, in my opinion, not a mass murderer. A spree killer is, of those three, the best answer of those three. But what about a rampage killer? And 42% of you have voted for that. So I covered mass shooters. I've written books about them. They are almost entirely indiscriminate in their victim choices, and they take their own lives. It doesn't feel like there's indiscriminate taking of victims here. It feels like at least two victims are, well, I wouldn't say at least two, at least one victim was chosen, maybe two. Magic says, I disagree, it's too early. Well, that's a good point. You could make the argument that it's too early. Time will tell, I guess. I'm saying at this point, it's not a serial killer. But I suppose you could argue in the fullness of time, it could eventually be. That's certainly true. But I personally don't think it's going to come to that. So there is a slight overlap in terms of an incel type character who's a student, who's also familiar with certain people, as Elliot Rodger was. And that overlap may extend from transferring a sense of social and sexual rejection to targeting primary victims, as Rodger did. So I wrote a book about Elliot Rodger, and what's interesting with him is he targeted specific individuals, and then he also targeted indiscriminately, less and less specific victims. And in a way, you could argue, isn't that the case here? That this person killed one or two people purposefully and one or two people indiscriminately. Well, we've got a model for that, an incel, potentially. So, as I said, this could explain the secondary casualties of Ethan and Zaina, but why the incel aspect doesn't quite fit, it's the same reason as the mass shooter, because the incel, incel aspect, well, there's the sparing of the two survivors and the likelihood that the killer didn't and hasn't taken his own life. So when you have a sort of full-blooded incel type, they tend to be at the end of their rope, at the end of their tether, and they are now going to commit suicide. You know, they're going to kill people and it's targeted, but at the end of all that, commit suicide. It's like, I'm so devastated that I can't get laid, I'm going to die, but I'm going to also get my revenge while I'm doing it. The mass shooter probably feels the same way, but it's also, I hate society and I'm suicidal, I'm going to take my life at the same time. This doesn't have that aspect. There's not a suicidal aspect, which makes you think this killer was getting laid at least a little bit, was to some extent integrated in society, that he was possibly attending some of these parties. So once again, it's where do you move that line in terms of the spectrum of familiarity with the victims and with the house? That's the part that's really, really difficult. It's difficult to know because we're not talking to the roommates. the surviving roommates. It's difficult to know because we aren't talking to other students who could know this, and in a way we shouldn't, because if we did, you would have the kind of speculation where you'd say, you know what, there's this guy who came around and he acted, okay, well, maybe he's a suspect. And we can't really afford to do that willy-nilly, recklessly. That is what law enforcement needs to do. So we're kind of in a bind. We know what we need to know, but we can't really deal with it because it can't really be a public media, it can't be a social media discussion. Could this person be a suspect? Let's look at their social media. Let's put their name and face on social media. Maybe not, but then someone thinks maybe, and then they get arrested. It is a conversation I want to have. Let me play that part of the clip. It is a conversation I want to have where they've spoken about possibly charging people in social media with crimes for making certain statements. And then you literally had someone literally perpetrating fake news on social media, like literally faking screams and faking a mainstream media news article, even though law enforcement is saying, you know, we're going to charge people who do things that lead to intimidation. And I don't know, it seems like this person may have done that regardless. So what is going to happen then? I've seen some scrubbing of that person's profile in terms of their videos, but are the police actually going to charge anyone in social media for what has already been done? Let me put that up over here. That's from this segment from News Nation.
The rental home that was filled with friendship and the joys of college life has been tragically quiet for weeks. A 24/7 security guard is here to preserve a quadruple murder scene. Neighbors no longer want to comment, and locals wonder why a full month hasn't yielded more answers.
It doesn't.
Ceremony. No arrest has been made, and family members of the victims are asking for answers. Rumors are swirling on the internet about the killer, and police are cracking down on social media sleuths, threatening possible charges.
So that's the part I wanted to raise. The law enforcement have already spoken about possible charges for social media sleuths. So those of you who want to speculate recklessly, that's what's in the offing. And some people have been speculating not only recklessly, but in a way that's beyond that. Looks like they've been purposefully misleading. And are there going to be consequences to that? We may actually see consequences to that. Okay, so that's something I actually want to talk about, but not. Let's just complete this discussion. So perhaps the best definition of this crime and this criminal is a rampage killer as a subset of a spree killer. So we're talking about a spree killer as the best official definition and sort of general definition, but it doesn't quite fit the definition. So maybe we need a new definition, which is the definition of a rampage killer. What is clear is that the type of killing is idiosyncratic in its own way. It's gratuitous, but without an explicit sexual component. It's a rampage, right? So I agree with you guys. There is a rampage, but 2 students and a dog are spared. So it's not like a blind, absolutely someone who is exploding and everything around them gets destroyed. It's not like a nuclear rampage. It's sort of like a precision bomb, if I can put it that way. It's like a precision guided missile. And so it's going to kill certain people. So there's rampage, but there's also a weird contradiction to that. Well, I'm not going to kill them, and I'm not going to kill the dog, and I'm going to take the time to clean up certain things. Feels like that. The perpetrator closes some doors. I think he possibly cleans up after him, which suggests within this mind, this rage, I think there is terrible, tremendous rage, there is actually still a certain amount of mindfulness, which I think also confirms this idea that it's a student, because it's this idea of someone doing something incredibly dumb, not breaking into, but entering a house with 6 people inside, right? Your chance of getting caught or something going wrong is extremely high. But anyway, so he's doing something incredibly dumb, yet he executes it quite well in a sense, just in terms of the criminal thing. He's gotten away with it for a month. Isn't that because he did certain things that helped him, like cleaning up his shoe prints, like parking around the corner? Well, who would think to do things like that? Well, someone who's quite educated. So I don't think we're dealing with a dumb criminal. I don't think we're dealing with a uneducated sort of druggy person. I think we're dealing with someone who is a student, but perhaps immature. Do you see the contradiction there? Mindless rage, but where there's a certain amount of mindfulness. Now, doesn't a student fit that profile, where occasionally there's a period of blind emotion, and then the person comes back to their senses and integrates back into whatever? Isn't that the gratuitous life of a student anyway? You do things gratuitously and then you go back to class. Do things gratuitously, go back to class. Do things gratuitously and then go back to class. Mindless rage, but then mindfulness. Mindless rage, and then go back to class. Does that make sense? Okay, so in that contradiction, perhaps lies the answer. What sort of killer kills and does so viciously, but then also has compassion for some of his victims? Let me say that again. So we are talking about, there's a contradiction going on here. And doesn't the contradiction tell us something about the perpetrator? Paula Buck says he's gone back to the student fabric. It's also someone who's trying to find themselves, so they can at one moment be this person, another moment be that person. One moment be a killer, at another moment be back to being a student. They're trying to find who they are. But what sort of killer kills viciously, but then also has compassion for some of his victims? So Henry von Bredal, the triple X murderer, did you guys know this? He had 3 victims: his brother, his older brother, his parents, but he didn't finish his sister off. He had a younger sister. He was the middle child. And although he attacked her, and although she was seriously injured, she survived, and he could have finished her off, but he didn't. So it seems like he actually had a little bit of whatever it was, compassion, whatever it was. And then you say, why would he have compassion for his sister, but not for the rest of them? Maybe because it was his baby sister. Maybe because whatever he felt towards his brother and his mother and his father, he felt less so. I mean, he did attack his sister, but he didn't kill her. So why is there that contradiction with Henry? And you can apply exactly the same question with this Idaho student killer. Why was there compassion for the dog and also for the survivors? Was there any compassion? You could also say with Chris Watts, he didn't kill his dog. And you could even go so far with the Chris Watts case. Again, if you say family annihilation, that's what it is. He's an annihilator. I know exactly what happened there. Actually, no, you don't. If you know the Chris Watts case, you know that he started, his initial strategy was to bring about a miscarriage. His initial strategy was only to kill Nico. In other words, he wanted to bring about the minimum harm. What does that tell you? It tells you that actually he had a relationship with his victims. Actually didn't mean to do certain things, that he was conflicted, right? And so that same conflictedness is in this crime scene. And maybe that's one of the biggest clues. Maybe that should be the fourth clue we all missed, the conflictedness of the killer. So what sort of killer is careful in the middle of a slaughter? I don't think it's a total incel type person. It's someone who's not entirely gone over to the dark side, is very much in the dark side, but is not totally in the dark side. I think it's someone who's connected to some of the victims, but nevertheless disconnected from them. And how big a clue is that? I think this is someone who's connected to some of the victims, but nevertheless disconnected from them. What does that mean? I don't know exactly what that means. Adam says their bedroom doors were most likely locked and thus they were spared. That's a possible answer, but what if that's not the answer? I mean, I don't know. We don't know whether the bedroom doors were locked. Do you lock your bedroom door when you go and sleep? Do most people lock your bedroom doors when you go and sleep? I've got to. Cheryl says, I don't think it had anything to do with compassion. That's also possible. But if you think about this, one person kills a person, then another person, that's 2, then another person, that's 3, then another person, that's 4. And there are no police sirens, the cavalry is not on the way. Why stop there? So he's bad enough to kill in a certain way, but good enough not to commit a particular kind of attack. And there I'm talking about sexual violence. So that's the other aspect where you might say, like true crime may want to sensationalize this and tabloidize it, and say, this could be a serial killer, this could be extremely bad. But another way of looking at it is it's not nearly as bad as it could have been. The killer could have killed, I don't know how many people, and then conducted sexual violence on someone who wasn't dead yet, right? You could have had a Jeffrey Dahmer type thing going on. You could also have had a, if you go and deal with the ways that Danny Rolling killed his victims, there was quite an elaborate thing. There was photos, staging, lots of things that I don't even want to mention here. And in addition to that, sexual violence. None of that's present here, but it could have been, but it wasn't. So he's a murderer, but not a perpetrator of sexual violence. So think about that, and that's why it's not a serial killer, by the way. It's a murderer, but not a perpetrator of sexual violence. So who can that be? Who would commit a murder, who's so upset that they commit murder, but they're not really interested in sexual violence? Who could be in that frame of mind where sexual violence is out of the question? I'm not into sexual violence, but I'm so upset that I'm going to commit murder. But sexual violence is crossing a line. Who would think that way besides a boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend, or a potential boyfriend? Is that kind of thinking sound, or do you think it's not sound to say that? In conclusion, true crime law, that's LORE, concedes that these definitions aren't absolute, and that's one of the problems with true crime as it is now. There are crimes that occur for which there are incomplete or inaccurate definitions. And I've often come across that in true crime, where I'm dealing with something that's quite a unique scenario, and there's not a proper definition for it, which is why I've come up with things like true crime intertextuality. People think that's a made-up word, or intertextuality refers to something else. No, it refers to something that no one has really properly gone into, and so I'm going to give it a definition. In the same way, this particular crime doesn't quite fit the definitions that currently exist, which means maybe a new definition is required, which is why I say, aren't we dealing with a kind of rampage killer? Maybe because there isn't really, rampage killer isn't really a actual definition. Maybe it should be a limited rampage killer. I don't know. But anyway, so they say here, how to distinguish a spree killer from a mass murderer or from a serial killer is subject to considerable debate, right? That's what the that's a sort of an official position, that how we distinguish these various types of killers from one another is not clear, not certain, and is a matter of debate. Well, it shouldn't be. There should be clarity in these definitions. They should be defined. The definition should be fine-tuned and better defined, because until you do that, you're going to struggle to find your perpetrator if your definitions are wishy-washy. And that's where I think true crime rocket science kind of comes into it and says, guys, if you're not going to fine-tune your definition, we are. And we're going to talk about, what does someone say here? SW Firefly, says, I think rampage killer. Cash says, semantics are important in true crime. Not in terms of this. You're not overthinking it when you simply asking, what is our definition of this crime? That's not overthinking it. That's the first step. And you must think about like a rocket launch. The first thing a rocket does when it lifts off, it burns the most energy, and it feels like it's not going anywhere. So in this discussion, if you felt like, you know what, we haven't really gotten anywhere with you're just talking about defining this crime, but that's the starting point. You've at least got to get that part right. Otherwise, the rest of your rocket launch is going to be a disaster. Your rocket's going to start spin-wheeling and twirling around. You've got to get the start of your rocket launch in terms of launching your investigation off to the right start, based on the right note. Get that first note wrong, and everything else is going to be a mess. You may not actually catch the killer if you can't define the crime. So that's how important it is. You can't overthink this part. You can definitely underthink this part. So let me play this little clip again.
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
So we need to get our note right. Do you think we have? Do you think we are? In my view, the one thing that this perpetrator clearly isn't, as I've said over and over again, he isn't a serial killer. Obviously, if he commits another crime after this one, then clearly that's what he has become. As of this writing, I don't see him fitting that definition. I do sort of agree with this idea that he's, from whatever he's done and from whatever dynamic, he's tried to reintegrate himself into the student scenario. And he is, I guess, hoping to do what the Delphi killer did, live in plain sight and live happily ever after. Is that going to happen here? The big mistake they made in the Delphi case was they, in a way, assumed they were dealing with a transient deviant, someone like, evil doesn't exist in our town, so it comes from somewhere else. And that is the first mistake that they made, in my opinion. That they also saw that attack as kind of a random transient type attack, and I don't think it was. And because they didn't see it as a targeted attack, it took them almost 6 years to catch the guy that they've caught so far. Does it make sense what I'm saying? So there's a big difference in your criminal profiling if you can't decide whether it's targeted or not. There's a big difference in that aspect alone. Art Nixie says, what makes you think he will be caught? Well, he basically left behind 4 crime scenes in terms of 4 victims. So 4 opportunities to leave behind DNA, including blood DNA. Also, the amount of attention this case has gotten and the type of crime scene. Unlike the Delphi case, this is not an external crime scene. There was contamination in that case. There's contamination in this case, but inside those bedrooms, I don't think there's contamination. So there may be contamination in terms of the entry and exit parts, in terms of maybe, I believe that he went in the front door. That was how he got initial access. But I don't know if there's any shoe prints. Anyway, I think there's some contamination of the sort of communal areas, which is going to make things harder. But I still think they've got a lot of evidence. They've got, instead of 1 victim's cell phone, as they had in the Delphi case, they've got probably 4. So I think it's just going to, there's a lot more material. Also, they were able to get to the victims much earlier than they could in the Delphi case, within hours. So I think the perpetrator is going to be caught. Pauline says, I was waiting over on the other page for Kaylee's father describing open wounds. What happened to that live? I'm not sure what that's referring to. Unless yeah. Okay. I'm going to be providing another update a little bit later on. I was going to do it round about now, but I'm going to be doing it a little bit later. I need a bit of a break and I need to have dinner. Yeah, they thought it was an outsider in terms of Delphi. So, Pauline, are you following what I'm saying? I'm just going to have dinner and then I'll be back in a little while. Beverly Lawyer says the killer reminds me of a Brian Laundrie type. I think the killer has a bit more experience than Brian Laundrie, but I also think it's someone who's got Brian Laundrie's disadvantages. Not particularly good looking, somewhat like if you looked at Gabby and Brian, you could look at Brian and say, I don't know if he's good enough for her. Well, this perpetrator may have felt that, but someone else may have felt that as well. Sorry about that. Okay, I think I'm going to end off here at just under 2 hours. Let's look at the poll. 45% say rampage killer. I tend to agree with that. And the spree killer, it's not a mass murderer, it's not a serial killer. But if you have voted in the poll, thanks a lot for doing that. Thanks a lot for doing that.
Whether you're a creator or a small business owner.
Okay, any other points? Humble grower, I don't think that is the case here. We were told chest wounds. The other thing that I think is important to differentiate with Brian Laundrie was Brian Laundrie's life was one person, right? And he wasn't part of a student community because he never went to college. I think you could have a situation here where the killer's life did revolve around one person, but nevertheless, they're also part of the student community, and that is how it may involve the other victims. So I do think you want to look at someone who is in a way living a life that is fixated on someone or something or both. But definitely someone who's generally more of an outsider than everybody else. Timmy says, "Can I have tea, please?" He actually had some coffee, literally had some coffee a little bit earlier. Okay. So thanks everyone for being here. Let's just see who has certain comments. Mel Stiller. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a great point. Brian Laundrie committed suicide. I don't think this killer has done that. Brian Laundrie liked guns, and this killer liked knives. Yeah, so I think I'm going to have dinner. Sandy says, I think the killer is in plain sight. Yeah, I think it could be. It could also be, as I say, a relative of a student who attended some of these parties. Someone who wants to be a student but couldn't be. It could also be something like that, which was the case with Henry. Wolfie says, are you going to be live? I'm going to be live again. Bear in mind, there's another update coming today. I think I want to talk about social media misbehaving without naming names. Social media misbehaving in this particular case, even though they've spoken about people might be charged, social media has nevertheless misbehaved, seems like it anyway. So maybe we'll talk about that. Okay. Susan says, I'm going to watch this on replay. If you are watching this on replay, bear in mind you are able to use the thanks button if you enjoying this content or appreciating this content, or you feel it's worthwhile or meaningful to you. I also want to encourage you to share these videos to true crime communities that you feel could do with watching them, because the idea is to educate us on things like true crime definitions, and to reach the point where collectively we can say, you know what, let's push the serial killer thing aside. It doesn't look like that's what we're dealing with. And if we can all do that as a community, we can start as a community getting closer to the killer. We can maybe help solve this case. It's not going to help if some of us think, I think it's a serial killer, it's like the Gainesville. Let's collectively realize what is really going on here and collectively educate ourselves accordingly. Isn't that something worthwhile? Karina says, this was such an outstanding live. Look forward to later. Everybody have a nice break. Okay. Terry says, some family out there has concerns about their loved ones' change in behavior this past month. I hope they speak up. Do you think they will? I don't think they would. I don't think they would. How do you speak up? You know what? I actually think my son could have done this. Do you think that's going to happen? I think my brother could have, do you think that's going to happen? That is the idea, collective critical thinking. That's what we try and do on this channel. Okay, on that note, thanks a lot, Nicole. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. I will be back a little bit later. I'll need to obviously change the time, but I'll see you guys a little bit later. Thanks for joining me. See you guys next time. Take care. Are you snoring?